Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Vanessa Kubikub. I'm here representing advising and career services. Nice to see you all here and thank you for joining us and ending your week here with us. It's been a while since, we've all seen each other, since we've gotten together. And I think although we're not seeing each other physically, I think even seeing the names of fellow colleagues in different departments has brought a sense of familiarity and connectedness. I spoke with some colleagues myself who I normally would pass by in the hallways and say hello to, and we were saying it feels a bit like a reunion this week. So we're very excited to have you all here and reconnected as part of our 5th annual advisor training. So without further ado, we'll get started on today's presentation, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to Coordinator of Sexual Violence Prevention and Education at Humber College, Erin Brown, here today to speak about reconceptualizing resilience.
Hi, folks. Thank you for joining me for like the very end of your week. I don't know about anyone else, but like COVID weeks just feel like particularly exhausting. And so I'm really thankful that you opted to spend your Friday afternoon with me. I want to start with our land acknowledgement. And so Humber College is located within the traditional and treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, known as Etobicoke, the place of the Black Alders in Michi-Sageag language. The region is uniquely situated along Humber River watershed, which historically provided an integral connection for Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wyandot peoples between the Ontario Lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay regions. Now home to people of numerous nations, Etobicoke continues to provide a vital source of interconnection for all. We acknowledge and honor the land we are walking on, the marks and tracks of our ancestors, and the footprints of future generations to come. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge that we may all be attending from different places right now because we are existing virtual. And so I have put into a website in the chat for folks, native-land.ca. And you can actually learn more about the specific land and treaties and languages spoken on the land that you are, wherever you are on Turtle Island. I do think it's also important when we are doing a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to be talking a bit about resilience and a bit about trauma today too. I think it's really important to acknowledge the historical and ongoing colonization that's taking place on Turtle Island with respect to Indigenous folks. I think about the immense resilience that our Indigenous communities really show. And in spite of the ongoing violence, I'm thinking particularly about, like the Mi'kmaq people right now out east and the lobster fisheries and the violence that's taking place. I just really think it's important to hold that in our minds as we're having this conversation. Some housekeeping notes. Please keep your mics muted throughout unless otherwise invited to share. There'll be opportunities for folks to come on. And if you do, for any reason, need to unmute to be able to participate instead of writing in the chat box, feel free to raise your hand and let me know, and happy to do so. For folks who require closed captioning, you can use the 3 dots at the top toolbar to turn on closed captioning by clicking turn on live captions. And the session is being recorded, so you may be visible if you do have your videos on. I think I'm the only person. I'm all wrapped up in a blanket right now. I'm feeling very comfortable, so just know that it may be used for future promotion. And then we'll get started. So today's session I've called Reconceptualizing Resilience. And really, we have our learning outcomes here. Basically, I just want us to have like a little chitty chat about how we sort of perceive resilience, what sort of comes to mind when we think of it, how that might inform our practice. I want to challenge some of the ways that I've seen resilience as thought of, and I want us to be thinking of some other ways that we could conceive of it. With this being said, I do want to be mindful that I will be making reference to trauma like very broadly during this session. And while I won't be diving into any specific examples, I do think it's important to recognize that if we are making references to things like sexual violence, for instance, that this may be triggering for some folks who are in the session. Additionally, digging into resilience, this session may resurface some memories or experiences for folks. And so if you do need support, please do reach out to the Employee Assistance Program, EAP. And for folks who don't have access to that, please connect with your manager and find out some other options that might be available for you for support. I also want to do a bit of a self-location today, and so I want to acknowledge that I am a white settler. I am a cisgender man, and I identify as queer. I identify as agnostic, so I don't really, I always say subscribe to a religion. I don't know that subscribe is the right word. Maybe I'm just like too internet focused, but I think that that's important to acknowledge. I am a full-time staff member here at the college, but I am also a student at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, where I'm studying student development and student services in higher ed. My previous experience comes predominantly from residence life, though I also have experience in orientation and transition, co-curricular programs, first-generation student support, and now, of course, sexual violence prevention and education. I do have a history of depressive episodes, thoughts of self-harm and suicide. And I do have a few personal experiences with trauma, thinking about a time where I responded to a student death. I have had a traumatic leg injury. I would say more so though, I'm really in this place thinking of experiences of, secondhand experiences of trauma. And so thinking about, the number of disclosures around sexual violence that I have received over my time. And I also think it's important to note that I'm not like a neuroscience-y person who studies like adversity and resilience. I'm not a psychologist or any of those things. And I'll be making reference to several readings that have really informed my perspective on this throughout this session. But I thought that we could start by just thinking about, what is resilience? And so in the chat box, I'm hoping folks can just share some words that you think of when you hear resilience. So I see strength, ability to bounce back from challenges, bouncing back from adversity, flexibility and courage, overcoming challenge, stability, picking back up after falling, bouncing back, sticking through things, bravery. Thank you. Yeah, I think we can see some trends even just throughout these comments here, that idea of like bouncing back or getting back up, strength and courage are coming through this. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to look at some images, and we're going to think about what do the following images say about resilience. And so again, we can just use the chat box for this. But when I was thinking about this, I went to Google Images and just typed in resilience. And I was like, let's see what pops up and what themes come out of there. And so looking at these images here, what do we think that these say about resilience? So, folks with the cape or the flag and standing atop of the mountain, fist raised up. What do we think? So heroic, success, winning. Oh, I see Jen Liang's noting that they only seem to be female folks in these. Brave, climbed a mountain, so big obstacle, accomplishment. Yeah, I think, when I look at these, I really see this sort of assumption that resilience is like a finite moment in time. We get over that mountain that we've been climbing and like it's celebration time, which I just think is really an interesting perspective. And we'll dive into that a bit more shortly. And I see Caitlin has added here, things look very clear. It does not look busy, challenging, hard, or heroic. Yeah, like there's sunshine there, clear skies. What about with these images? So what do you think that these images say about resilience? The person who's kind of holding up the toppling dominoes, carrying an elephant on our back, pushing these boulders up a big mountain. So challenging, hardworking, persistent, overcoming obstacles. And so pushing something heavy, we think of weight when we look at these things. Hurdles and not giving up. Absolutely. I see that. What I find really interesting with these images too is that, we need to keep holding on to that burden forever. Like there seems to be no end in sight. And I see that no support at all alone, strenuous. And I feel these images don't really address where the elephant came from, where the boulder came from, where the dominoes are coming from. They don't really address that burden at all, just that we are like stuck with it. So I think that that's really interesting. What about these images? So we have the plant that's bursting through the concrete, or these little flowers that are growing in like patches of sand or what looks like would be a drought. What do we think of when we see these images and what they might say about resilience? So potentially growth, beauty, a new beginning. Yeah, I mean, they're very beautiful flowers. Thinking about strength, moving through something very challenging. When I look at these, I think it's really interesting because like I'm just shocked by this flower, bursting through the concrete or growing in this, very hostile environment. There's no nourishment here, which really stands out to me. And I think about, that there's nothing addressing the need of these plants to be able to thrive in this space here. So I think that that's really interesting. And I see some more comments here about, overcoming something challenging or against the odds. And then what about these images? So we have the umbrella and then these raindrops that are missing the person. What do we think this says about resilience? Or what comes to mind when you see these images? So protection comes to mind. Building up something to help you against storms. Finding solutions, so such as the umbrella, or creating your own environment within an environment. I think it's really interesting when I look at these because it looks like not a single raindrop is touching the person or the brain, which I just find really fascinating because like I don't know experiences with umbrellas, but I do not find them 100% effective. That that sort of stood out to me, is that saying resilience is something that's going to protect us. The rain won't touch us anymore, which I thought was really interesting from these images. And now we've got these ones. So we've got the person who's kind of pulling the I'm out of impossible. Someone cutting off the apostrophe T, so that says I can do it instead of I can't do it. And then these signs that say dust yourself off or bounce back. What do we think that these images are telling us? So potentially that, it's adaptable, it's about reframing. That reframing piece stands out to me. Like when I read these, it sort of suggests that it's just, it's simply a matter of attitude, or, the way you think. And I see that Vanessa has added here that, it seems maybe it's a bit simplistic, right? That all we need to do is like pull out our scissors and cut off that apostrophe T and boom, we can do it now. Which I just think is, very fascinating in the assumptions in that. And then we have one more here. So we have this person who is like firmly rooted in the ground. Their hair seems to be blowing. So it seems like there's probably winds And then we have someone who's strolling off into the sunset. So I see, it looks very positive, pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of attitude. What else do we think when we see these images? I think it's really interesting that the person who is like rooted to the ground doesn't seem to be moving whatsoever. Because I think about like even the CN tower is supposed to bend a tiny bit and adapt to the wind. So this makes it seem like so easy to me. So I find that really fascinating. And these are like all pulled from the top images that were coming up when I had Googled resilience, which I think is really interesting in what it says. Oh, and I like that comment there. It looks lonely. It's mostly solitary figures. And I think that that's a really important point for us to consider during this session as well. I ended up also looking just at some different definitions of resilience. When you type resilience into Google, just in search, it comes up with the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. And the example they give here is the often remarkable resilience of so many British institutions. I do think maybe we should remark less on the resilience of colonial institutions, or perhaps acknowledge how power and white supremacy play a role in that. And then the second definition here, the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape, elasticity. And that was something that folks had shared earlier when I had said, what words come to mind? There's this idea of like bouncing back or flexibility and that sort of thing. And I find that really interesting as if we undergo a struggle or a trauma and then just like return to the pre-trauma version of ourselves, which I don't think is realistic. And I think that we need to reflect on that and challenge that a bit. The Mayo Clinic provides this definition. So when you have resilience, you harness your inner strength that helps you rebound from a setback or challenge, such as a job loss, an illness, a disaster, or a loved one's death. If you lack resilience, you might dwell on problems, feel victimized, become overwhelmed, or turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as substance abuse. Resilience won't make your problems go away, but resilience can give you the ability to see past them, find enjoyment in life, and better handle stress. And I find it's really interesting, this emphasis on inner strength without really referencing any external supports, whatever, that it's just something that we need to have in us. And, it seems like a very typically like Western individualistic perspective. I think about this piece around like lacking resilience as dwelling on problems, as if there aren't like really serious problems that we might need to dwell on in our lives. And, feeling victimized, becoming overwhelmed. Like, I actually think that those are entirely reasonable reactions to a lot of things in our lives. And so I just find that really fascinating that stood out there. And I want to challenge that a bit. There's a website, an organization, Positive Psychology, who defines resilience as that ineffable quality that allows people to be knocked down by life and come back stronger than ever. Rather than letting failure overcome them and drain their resolve, they find a way to rise from the ashes. In a nutshell, resilience can be defined as the ability and tendency to bounce back. And that was something else that sort of, both that idea of bouncing back, but I think someone had also mentioned in the chat that idea of like getting back up again, right? And I think that we really love this idea of like the bounce back and coming back stronger than ever. But I do really think about, what happens to the folks who don't feel stronger, or who aren't stronger, or who feel alienated by this definition through their own experiences. This comment about like rising from the ashes is interesting to me because like, okay, but what about folks who don't feel that sense of triumph from this experience? Because I think that ties back, I think someone earlier had said like heroic with one of the images. And it doesn't really acknowledge, what does someone need to rise from the ashes, right? And also what do we need after rising from the ashes? Like, I think I would need a shower. I would need some new clothes. I would probably need some mental health support to like really unpack that experience. So like, what are the supports for people? I really feel like this definition is obsessed with strength. And I think that we need to give folks the space to not be strong. And then the American Psychological Association defines resilience as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. As much as resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences, it can also involve profound personal growth. And they also say resilience involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that anyone can learn or develop. And so I actually mostly like this definition, but I do still really think about it, like it seems so focused on the individual and not thinking about like a community support response, not thinking about those external supports. And again, we just see this idea of bouncing back. And I think about, that return to original shape that I think is very unrealistic for folks who've experienced traumatizing events or distressing events. And so we are going to chat a bit about trauma now, because I do think that we often tend to think of resilience in response to trauma, and we even see that in that American Psychological Association definition. So I think it's important for us to get a bit of an understanding of trauma. Kim H. defines trauma as the lasting emotional response that often results from living through a distressing event. Experiencing a traumatic event can harm a person's sense of safety, sense of self, and ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. Long after the traumatic event occurs, people with trauma can often feel shame, helplessness, powerlessness, and intense fear. And so I think it's really important to already contrast that feeling of powerlessness with all these ideas of strength that are coming out in these definitions of resilience. And a trauma is not something that we just let go and leave it behind in our past. Those are things that we really carry with us. And so I think about that contrast with the definition of resilience. I do also think beyond this idea of a distressing event, that we need to acknowledge secondary trauma that folks can experience from supporting someone who has experienced a distressing event. I also think about all the events that we see on the news, in particular this year. There's been a lot of violence that we're seeing, thinking about incidents of anti-Black racism, thinking about white supremacist and colonial violence against Indigenous folks that is just consistently broadcast across our screens. I also want to note here that Carrillo and Butler had noted in 2014 that by the time youth reach college, 66 to 85% report lifetime traumatic event exposure, and many report multiple exposures. And so what this says to me is that we can be reasonably safe in assuming that the students we're engaging with have experienced a trauma or are going to experience a trauma, perhaps during the times that we're seeing them over a repeated number of interactions potentially. So we really need to be sensitive to this fact. I'm not going to be speaking specifically about trauma-informed practices, but if you haven't done any learning about that, I really strongly encourage you to do so and to look into that. I think that that's really important across the institution. But I now want to dive into this piece that Bim and Feldman wrote earlier this year. They posted it in January, and they were writing in response to an essay asserting that we should avoid trigger warnings because it's paternalistic and makes students fragile or soft. And I'll post a copy or a link to it in the chat if folks want to pull up the link on your own, because I really, really encourage it, especially for folks who teach, because it is focused around pedagogy. But I really like this piece here about noting that trauma is endemic. We live in traumatizing times, and those traumas don't vanish when we enter the university, or in our case, the college. In fact, they may be exacerbated. Now, this was written before we all went into lockdown and before, all of this year happened. But I don't think it needs to be emphasized to note that we do live in traumatizing times right now. And in this article, they really discuss the micro changes that we can make in our own practices, but also thinking about, the need for macro changes. So I thought that was really interesting. I do think that, we know a lot of trauma can come from experiences such as sexual violence. But I think that, looking at this piece about how traumas might be exacerbated by our institutions, I think that we also need to acknowledge and consider the ways in which our institutions inflict trauma upon our students through potentially our policies and procedures, through abuses of power, through an emphasis in our academics on engaging purely intellectually and not emotionally, and this emphasis on grit. And so I really think that we do need to reflect on the ways that our practices might either cause traumas or cause those traumas to resurface for folks. They also note in this article, and I apologize, there's a lot of big block quotes that I'm putting on here, but the way they say it's just so good. But they note regarding resilience that the idea that one could return to a previous state after experiencing trauma is yet another reflection of the ways in which institutions and individuals alike fail to understand how trauma dramatically restructures who we are and how we navigate the world. To bounce back after crisis or trauma implies that one has gotten over it, has moved on, and is cured. And so these ideas really like simplifying trauma and not recognizing the complexity of it. They really argue here that we don't necessarily get over our trauma. We really carry that with us, and we continue to exist with it. We coexist with our traumas. And so they argue for a shift from resilience to patience and melancholy. And so they say softness and sadness exist in all of us. Consider a world in which we name those hurts and use them in our journey forward, rather than resolve, repress, or leave them in the past entirely. And so, they're really talking here about acknowledging that something might actually never be resolved. Like we might not have that elasticity to return to that pre-trauma shape that we were, but continuing to survive on one's own terms, really allowing us to make space to be able to hold that hurt, and instead of seeing that hurt as contradictory to moving forward. I think that often when we talk about moving forward, there's this idea that we're leaving behind that pain, that trauma that we've experienced. And this is really about also being able to hold that and acknowledge it and make space for that. And recognizing that our folks are actually holding that in our classrooms or in our meetings that we're having with them or at our events. And so I want to chat a bit about moving to a collectivist approach to resilience and a bit more of a critique of resilience some more. And so Niccolazzo and Carter published this chapter in Rethinking College Student Development Theory Using Critical Frameworks. And it's a duo ethnography between two trans folks. Niccolazzo also has a disability and Carter is racialized. And we're going to unpack a bit of a poem that Carter also wrote called Resilience. So we're going to dive into that. They write that previous conceptions of resilience invest in deficit perspectives of student development in college. Either one has resilience or one does not, and it is on the individual to be resilient rather than focus on the ways college environments are toxic for marginalized populations. And I think that this is, in some ways, like a very damning perspective of our higher education environments, and I think rightfully so. Considering resilience as an individualistic construct means that we're pitting, people against one another as either having this like grit or resilience or not. We need to acknowledge how things like disability might actually affect our ability to practice resilience. And I think that we also really need to acknowledge that our campuses and our spaces are not necessarily safe for all folks. As much as we might like to think so, as much as we might try to, often folks are not necessarily able to bring their whole selves to spaces on campus. And so that might be, for instance, needing to choose in a space whether you're leaning into your racialized identity versus your trans identity, or vice versa. And then also thinking about the exhaustion in navigating those spaces and having to essentially code switch in those spaces, having to choose which parts of yourself you can bring into the for being whole at the institution. And so Nicolazzo and Carter proposed moving towards a community-based idea of resilience. And so thinking about, for instance, how Black folks resist anti-Black racism, not individually, but as a community, and thinking about how do we, work towards that and acknowledge that. And so Riss Carter wrote a poem, Resilience. I will post a link to that in the chat afterwards, because I don't have that pulled up, but you can listen on your own time. And some of the lyrics here I want to pull for folks. So, wow, Riss is so resilient, a term used by the people that create those situations. And so acknowledging that, we often frame individuals as like, isn't it so impressive that they are able to stand up in the face of these oppressions, in the face of these traumas, and like, good for them. While not acknowledging like, how are we contributing to those things? In what ways are we potentially exacerbating that? So I think that that's really important, that I think that perspective sometimes removes any onus and responsibility and shifts it to the individual to have to be resilient in the face of that. Another one of these lyrics, these spaces I reside in aren't made for me to thrive in. So speaking about the institution, and then let go of the meaning, the feeling that I must lead with resiliency. I can't handle it right now, not anymore. And so again, thinking about the onus that we place on our students to be resilient, and we try and coach them through that and be supportive through that. But what really is our responsibility to consider the structures, the policies and procedures that are in place that are working towards that and contributing to that? I think that we are probably trying to both support our students while sometimes also enacting some harmful procedures and policies. So I think that that's really important for us to be thinking about. And, they really talk about resilience as finding ways to navigate toxic campus culture. So I think that that's really important. I'm thinking, a recent example at the University of Ottawa, where there are numerous faculty who are arguing that they have the right to say the N-word in an academic setting. And like that is such a toxic environment for Black students at the University of Ottawa. And to see that so many of the professors there, I think there was like 30 faculty members who signed on to a letter essentially saying that they should have the right to be able to say the N-word. That to me is going to traumatize. It's going to harm their experience and whether they feel safe. And are we placing the onus on them to be resilient in spite of that? And in many ways, I think, do we earn a lot of students' presence on our campuses in many ways? They also talk about challenging norms and thinking about, these compulsory societal expectations around able-bodiedness, able-mindedness, heterosexuality, and resilience as existing in spite of these compulsory expectations, but it doesn't actually challenge these compulsory expectations. And so, they say that marginalized folks need to be resilient in order to present or conform into this idea of being normal or fitting into those social expectations. And existing as someone who is outside of that norm of white cisgender patriarchy is seen as resilience. And I even think about with like beauty standards and fat phobia and that sort of thing. Recently, there was a lot of conversation where Billie Eilish was, walking outside and like wearing not makeup on and all those sorts of things. And there was all this conversation around, isn't Billie Eilish so brave for being seen in public like this? And almost like, isn't she so resilient and challenging the norms in that way? And like, wow, good for her. But we're not actually challenging like why that's a super messed up perspective to have, and how we don't really make space to desire or reject social expectations. And I think that that's really important for us to be considering with this. And then Nick Lazo and Carter also talk about moving from campus to community. And so despite a focus on making our campuses a space of belonging, for some folks, it's actually just better for them to seek environments outside of the campus community that are more welcoming, that are swifter to adapt, because higher education institutions are not necessarily quick adapters in many circumstances. And so practicing resilience can also mean removing ourselves from those toxic environments. Instead of being resilient, we're going to step outside of the spaces that don't welcome us. We're not going to try and tough it out or be strong in a space that harms or rejects. And the expectation shouldn't be that we have to be strong or stay within spaces that harm us. The off-campus community was through certain research studies a source of strength and restoration to then be able to survive the campus. And so folks needed to essentially leave the space to be able to be restored through their connections with communities, to even be able to come back onto our campuses. I really think about how so much theory and research and student development focus is on the importance of campus connections and involvement. But what if the campus is a toxic environment or is harmful to a student? Our inclination, I think, is often to keep things within the institution. But if things aren't working for all students, then we need to allow them and also encourage them to be actually, be away from the campus, to be able to exist outside and seek community supports, and acknowledge that for some folks, only being on campus for academics is what's actually healthier for them. And, that's something that might help them avoid those traumatic spaces and those harms. And I think about, like Aston, theory of student involvement and all these places and research that has been done often historically on like white men as students and that sort of thing. And so I think with the limitations of that research and how we need to be mindful that it doesn't necessarily reflect all of our student populations. I do come back to this question of how do we earn the right for our students to want to be on our campuses, to engage with our services. And I really think about, it's not about keeping them here, but about making our services and spaces somewhere where they can be. So those are some of the reflections that's really come out of me through some of these readings and these learnings. And then they talk about this idea of community-based resilience. So coalition building, finding people to challenge and change the campus, so that it does not exclude, oppress, or marginalize. I think a lot about the importance of student activism and how we can foster that, and how ideally our student unions, for instance, foster that. I think that there are some great student leaders out there. Josh Lamers is a great example. He's currently a law student at Windsor, was previously a master's student at Ryerson, and have done a lot of work to challenge our toxic institutional environments and anti-Black racism at our institutions. And so I do think about how can we foster that in our students and encourage that, even if it means that they might challenge some of our policies and procedures and approaches. They talk about moving from individualized resilience as being something separated from the community to this idea of resilience as a community endeavor, that we all need to be involved within this process as a form of really seeking justice, structures, and systems. And that we need to do that with a group of people, that it can't be a solo endeavor. And that actually that shared responsibility is something that allows us to continue and can fuel us. And so they talk about resilience as being an ongoing practice we engage in with and alongside each other. And I think that that really challenges all of those images that we saw from Google, where again, it was like always a solo person, or it was like a solo plant breaking through the concrete or the desert. All of that was so individual, and I think that this really challenges that. And so I had tried to pull together some implications for practitioners, and I think that it's really important for us to understand that our students have likely experienced or will experience trauma, and that could profoundly affect them. And so how does that inform how we communicate with them, how we engage with them, and how we support them? I think that trauma-informed practice is necessary. And I think that it should be funded by the institution. And so that means that if folks need to be learning about this, and there's development opportunities, I think that that should be paid for. And I think that we should be demanding that from our respective managers, directors, and whoever. I think that we need to consider whether resilience is the goal. And when I say that, I'm talking about like that individualized idea of resilience and those common misconceptions. You know, are we trying to get students to move on from their trauma, or are we trying to create a space where they can hold that? And are we making our spaces somewhere where they can hold on to that and coexist with it within our spaces without feeling shame, without feeling a need to hide that or discard that at the door? Again, I think that we do need to think beyond the individual. And when we're supporting students or advising them, who are the people in their life, the supports that they have? What are the communities that they have access to? And I think that that means also considering what are the communities beyond the institution. And sometimes that requires us to do a bit of learning about what resources are available in the GTA, for instance, as something that these folks could access. I do think that we need to create a safer space for folks when other parts of the college fall short. And parts of the college will fall short, like all of us will, at different points in times and in different ways. And I, you know, something that continues to stick with me that I had received as advice is to think about, you know, we don't always have the power to change things. There are things that are outside of our control, but what is within our control is how we can work within our own spheres of influence to be able to supplement when those other pieces of the institution do fall short. And lastly, I think that we do need to be radicalized. So yes, support the student, but if our focus is only ever on the student and not considering the factors that are influencing their experiences, if we're not thinking about our policies and procedures and the potential harms that they are having on our students, then we need to do better. We really need to disrupt this system. So those are sort of like my thoughts and ramblings. I owe a great deal of gratitude to Bim and Feldman, as well as Nicolazzo and Carter, as well as to Stephanie Waterman. And I learned a lot through her course on advanced student development theories, and that's caused me to reflect on this. But at this point in time, we can hold the space for questions if folks have any. But otherwise, I hope that you enjoy your weekend. Happy Halloween. If you have costumes, please, I encourage you to go off video and show them off, because I would like to see that. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy your day. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, they can feel free to add it in the chat or unmute their mic. And if not, I'm sure they know where to find you virtually. Okay. Oh, we do have a question here. Do you have any recommendations for supporting resilience virtually?
I think that's a great question. I would say that, I'm not entirely certain truth of it. The virtual environment is so challenging. I'm a person that in my previous roles, whenever I was offering support to students, it was almost exclusively face-to-face. And there might be times where I was on call where, I would be having a conversation with a student over the phone. But I find it really challenging. I think a lot about what are the supports within our community that folks can access virtually and remotely, particularly because of physical isolation and distancing measures. There are certain supports that, for instance, might not be offered in person anymore. So how do we figure out what those are and how folks can access those? I also think about, and this is perhaps my own bias, but I think about, I really think all of our conversations with students need to be on reflection. And so how can we still guide them through that process, and how can we potentially provide prompts for students and different questions to help steer that? Ask them, what are the challenges they are experiencing that are potentially related to that, and what supports do they think would be helpful for them in navigating that? I really think that we just let the students steer that conversation. I know that that's a really a long rambly answer with maybe not a lot of specifics. And I don't know, I know that there are some folks in the audience who, for instance, do a bit more focus on student support, as student support intervention coordinators, or other folks who perhaps work in residence life, who might be able to share some of the strategies that they are using to support students. So maybe that's something that participants can either share in the chat or unmute. What are some of the ways that you are fostering student resiliency or encouraging that? If anyone wants to share, you're welcome to type that in or unmute and share. And if there are other questions, feel free to type those into the chat as well, or put your hand up. I agree. The virtual environment is super challenging to really connect with students. And I know that our students are feeling that as well. I'm just going to put up the slide for feedback for folks. But I work with a group of placement students every fall semester. And we've been adapting our expectations for them and recognizing that they are super burnt out by this learning environment. And that like it really is taking a toll on them mentally and emotionally. I also think about like I run a lot of events and programs, and we're not getting a lot of engagement from our students because the Zoom fatigue is real for folks. And so one of the ways that we've been address that is through building passive content as well. And so we had an event planned where we were like gonna bake cookies virtually and like lead like a sort of baking class while talking about bystander intervention with students. And we had 0 student attend. And I was like, cool, we're still going to bake the cookies. We're still going to record that conversation. And then we can share that out as a video for folks to access afterwards. So that students are still able to get access to that information in a way that might suit their energy needs right now. Because like I'm very content to receive a lot of passive information instead of active information right now. And I see that Will in the chat has shared that in residence, we are connecting with the students in a Discord community, which helps bring them together. And we set up check-in meetings with them throughout the semester. Otherwise, we also host programs, including through Discord. And Will, maybe you can share what Discord is, because I haven't heard of that before.
Hi, I'm unmuting myself for this, but I'm not going to turn my camera on because my hair. But yeah, Discord is essentially an online community platform where it's almost like social media, but we find it's a place where you can have different channels where if we want people who are interested in memes to talk about memes, we have a specific spot for that, or people who want to talk about LGBTQ plus community, there's a specific spot for that. But also it's just a general chat for students to be able to connect. And it was especially very helpful at the beginning of the semester when they were trying to meet new people and they weren't able to necessarily meet in groups outside of their rooms in residence. So overall, we use it to pass on information or updates, and they're able to join some voice channels in there as well to connect that way. But yeah, overall, it's a good place that they've been using to just kind of like hub together to kind of replace the fact that lounges aren't open.
Thanks for sharing that, Will. And when I think about that and creating a space for that, I wonder about for faculty members who have access to Blackboard, like how do you build community in that space and allow folks to be able to just like engage with one another, whether it's like super relevant to the class or not? Like, is there space for students to just with one another? Because I think that we are all really struggling with that right now. I am doing a couple courses right now around creating accessible documents. And one of the things that I really appreciated was like, just like our introduction discussion board posts that we had to do, and seeing that like the other ways that folks are coping with COVID right now was like really affirming. I think a lot of us shared like our exhaustion with the current state. And again, like being able to be open about that and how like things suck sometimes, and just being able to acknowledge that. And I see Jen has added a comment here as well. Heard a lot about the tech-based programs students are using, Discord. That's information right from their program coordinators and ADs, I'm assuming as associate deans. And I see that Kimberly has also noted making events information videos for students to consume when works best for them as a great way to make things more accessible. I also think maybe going in with that and thinking about like the specific work that I do, I talk about sexual assault with people. And so a lot of my stuff potentially does bring up traumas and triggers for folks. And so for me, that means, for instance, sending out a PDF with resources that are available for folks in advance of sessions, and sending out a disclaimer so that folks know what we're going to be touching on when we're going to be having those conversations, so that they can set that space up for them as best needed. And something that I do with one of my workshops bringing in the bystander. There's several activities in there that I know are probably going to be fairly triggering for some students who maybe have lived experience. And so I also give permission to participants to step away for those activities as needed. And I let them know that, this is going to take about, 15 minutes. And so it's 3:57 right now. If you want to come back around like 4:12, the activity should be over then, and then you're welcome to rejoin us. And so being really flexible with our students and recognizing that, to me, is part of my trauma-informed practice.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. So I guess if there aren't any more questions, we could wrap up. If you haven't accessed the survey yet, it's there on the screen. I also sent it in the chat. So hopefully you're able to access that. And when you open that up, just make sure you select Re-conceptualizing Resilience so you get access to the session specific survey. Before we head out today, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Erin for putting on such an amazing workshop for us today and ending week 1 of advisor training with so much to think about as we go forward. I think not only in our roles, but in our personal lives as well. Erin, as you were speaking, I was doing a lot of reflecting on my own practice and, my views on resilience and how that might impact my interactions with students who might be going through challenging times and maybe experiencing that pressure to be strong, brave, and fit within that definition of resilience. So again, thank you for all of your hard work on delivering this presentation to us. That concludes week 1 of advisor training. On behalf of Advising and Career Services, have a great rest of your evening. Enjoy your weekends. Looking forward to seeing you next week, and take care. Thank you again.